Yes, this is one muscle cell. Okay, so we said that the action potential, the electrical current, travels down the axon. When it gets to the end, it can't be automatically transmitted to the muscle fiber because notice they do not actually touch. There is a microscopic gap between them, and it is called the synaptic cleft. Okay, a cleft is a space. Synaptic cleft. So instead, what happens is, we said that the synaptic knobs store a chemical called the neurotransmitter. There's going to be these little sacs in the synaptic knobs. These are called synaptic vesicles. Vesicle just means sac. And these will store the neurotransmitter, which is a chemical. So we'll put the little neurotransmitter molecules in here. And different neurotransmitters are released from different types of neurons. You guys have probably heard the names of neurotransmitters if you're watching TV and you see sometimes commercials come on about medications that affect different neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. So you often hear about these different neurotransmitters. You sometimes hear their names. The neurotransmitter for skeletal muscle is called acetylcholine, abbreviated ACH. Okay, so let me write this down over here. And it is a chemical, okay, stored in these little sacs, these little synaptic vesicles. Okay, it's acetylcholine. This is all one word, but it's abbreviated big A, big C, little h. Okay? So that is what we have inside the little synaptic vesicles. So when the action potential gets to the end of the axon, the acetylcholine will actually be released from these vesicles. Some of these vesicles will come up, they'll come all the way up to the membrane here of the axon. They will open up and they'll release their acetylcholine. It will go across the synaptic cleft and it will bind to receptors on the sarcolemma. So notice that this part of the sarcolemma is all folded up. When we have folds in a membrane, what do those folds do for the membrane? Increase the surface area, right. So the sarcolemma is folded up here so that we have more surface area for these receptors. Okay. And so these are receptors for acetylcholine. Okay, and this part of the sarcolemma that's all folded has a special name. It is called the motor end plate. Okay, motor end plate. Okay, so it has receptors for acetylcholine. Okay, so that is basically what the neuromuscular junction looks like. And let's just put in the action potential again. Okay, so the action potential, I'm just going to abbreviate that, AP. Okay, so it's going to travel down the axon. When it gets to the end of the axon, the acetylcholine is released. Acetylcholine will travel across the synaptic cleft. So here's our acetylcholine coming along, and it will bind to the receptors here on the motor end plate. When acetylcholine binds to its receptors, that will trigger an action potential in the muscle fiber. So acetylcholine does not go anywhere else. It binds to receptors, but that will now trigger the next step. And that is what you already know. You already know that the muscle fiber will have an action potential, right? So the way that the action potential in the muscle fiber is triggered is by the acetylcholine binding to the motor end plate, okay? So when the acetylcholine binds, that will trigger an action potential in the muscle fiber that will spread away from the neuromuscular junction in both directions. So the action potential will travel along the sarcolemma in both directions now. And you guys know that we have T-tubules that are continuous with the sarcolemma, right? They would come down inside the muscle cell. They also carry the action potential down inside the muscle cell. So you could add some T-tubules if you wanted to, okay? And you can put your action potential going down the T-tubules. Remember, on either side of the T-tubules, we have those little sacs, right? What are the little sacs called? On either side of the T-tubules, we have terminal cisterns, right? So terminal cisterns would be on either side here. Okay, and the terminal cisterns store calcium ions. Right, so when the action potential travels down the T-tubule, the calcium is released, comes out into the sarcoplasm, and binds to troponin, right? And then that causes tropomyosin to move and the filaments slide. So that is the whole contraction process, okay? Starting with the action potential in the motor neuron. So again, what we drew here is the neuromuscular junction. If you want to know, well, what exactly is the neuromuscular junction, it would include the end of the axon, okay? This would include the end of the axon here, the synaptic cleft, and the motor end plate of the muscle fiber. So this is the neuromuscular junction. Okay. You guys have any questions on that? So when you're running through those steps leading to muscle contraction, you can add action potential travels down axon, acetylcholine is released and binds to receptors on the motor end plate, right? And then that causes the action potential in the muscle fiber. When you guys take physiology, you will go through all of this again, but you will go into it in more detail. You'll be adding more to it, right? Mm-hmm. So this will give you a good foundation for it, though. You'll know a lot of it already. Do you guys have questions, anything at all? Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, what was that again? What was this? Yeah, so what I was doing is just drawing a little bit more detail in the muscle fiber. I was putting in T-tubules and terminal cisterns on either side of the T-tubules. So this is just, the structure of the muscle cell. And remember that the action potential, as it travels along the sarcolemma, it will also travel down the T-tubules. That will cause the release of calcium from the terminal cisterns. Calcium binds to troponin. So this is just kind of what we've been talking about, happening inside the muscle cell. Okay.
How many neuromuscular junctions are there for muscle fiber?
That is a good question. Thank you for asking. Okay, so each muscle fiber would have just one. neuromuscular junction, usually located roughly in the center of the fiber. But do we have a motor neuron for every single muscle fiber in the muscle? No. Actually, that's not necessary. Why? Because remember that if you look at the structure of the axon here, remember we said the axons branch. So whenever this motor neuron is sending its action potential, the action potential will travel along all of those branches, and these can synapse on different muscle fibers within that muscle. So one motor neuron could supply literally hundreds of muscle fibers. And they do, especially in our larger muscles where we don't need really precise control, like muscles in, let's say, the thigh area or the trunk area. We have these large, what are called motor units, where one motor neuron will supply many, many muscle fibers. Whenever that motor neuron sends its action potential, all those muscle fibers contract together and we get a strong contraction. Now in areas where we need really precise movements, like in our fingers or in the eyes, we actually have smaller motor units, so there is maybe more of a one-on-one ratio, and that way we get better control. Okay, and actually you guys need to know that. So let's talk about that next. Any other questions on this? I'm gonna erase this. Okay. So let's go back to this just for a minute. And I don't know, I know all of you didn't get a chance to look at these, so some of you asked me about this last time. This is actually what is shown on these models. Remember, this is one muscle fiber or cell, and this is actually the end of the axon. So this is showing the neuromuscular junction. Okay, these folds here that look like, you know, little kind of folds in the cell membrane, that's exactly what those are. This is the motor end plate, and these are synaptic knobs. Okay, so I want you to be able to identify that on this model. This would be extra credit, but I will ask you about all this stuff on the written exam. Okay, and this is the same thing. This is also a muscle fiber, and this is the end of the axon here. So again, showing the neuromuscular junction. Okay. Okay, so this is showing one axon branching just 3 times, so it can supply 3 muscle fibers, and each of these would be a neuromuscular junction. Okay, and let's come back to this in just a second. When we look at the neuromuscular junction in the book, you can see if you look at this kind of close-up that they drew, this is basically what I just drew. Okay, so this is the end of the axon, this is the synaptic knob. And these are synaptic vesicles with the acetylcholine. Okay, this is the synaptic cleft, and this is the motor end plate with, you know, all the folds of the sarcolemma here, and these are receptors for acetylcholine. Okay, so what you just asked about, Kelly, is what is shown here. Okay, so notice that we have this one axon, it's branching, again, they're showing 3 branches here. So this one motor neuron, when it sends its action potential, it would be transmitted along these 3 branches of its axon. So these 3 muscle fibers will receive the action potential and they will contract together. So this is what is called a motor unit. The motor unit is one motor neuron plus all of the muscle fibers that it supplies or that it synapses on. Okay, M is just muscle. And because they contract together, it's called a motor unit. This can be small, like this one's pretty small, right? Just 3 muscle fibers are controlled by this motor neuron. And again, that would give us better control over the movement. Or these can be very large, where there can be literally hundreds of muscle fibers supplied by this one motor neuron. and that would give us a really strong contraction. Okay, you guys, so we are almost done, and I just want to say one more thing about this, and we will be finished with muscle tissue, okay? Now, we've talked about the steps leading to contraction. What has to happen now to allow this cell to relax after a contraction? Well, everything kind of just reverses, right? We have to get rid of the calcium, and then, you know, when it's no longer binding to troponin, the tropomyosin goes back, covers actin's binding sites, and then myosin can't bind anymore. But calcium is a chemical, right? Once it's out in the sarcoplasm, it will keep binding to troponin. So we have to get rid of that. And that's what I was talking about earlier. It actually has to be pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay, so that's one thing that has to happen. The other thing that has to happen is acetylcholine is another chemical that, as long as it's, you know, kind of released and hanging out in that synaptic cleft, it will keep binding to the motor end plate, and it will keep causing contraction. So to allow the cell to relax, following a contraction, the calcium is pumped, and this is actually called a pump. It's called a calcium pump. You guys will talk about ion pumps when you take physiology. These use ATP. They're an active transport mechanism, which means they use a lot of energy from the cell, and the calcium has to be literally pushed back into those terminal cisterns. So that it's not able to keep binding to troponin. So pumped back into, and they're called calcium pumps. So little calcium pumps. Okay, and then also acetylcholine is broken down by an enzyme, and it's actually broken down in the synaptic cleft. And the enzyme is called acetylcholine esterase. This is all one word. Okay, acetylcholine esterase. This is abbreviated like this. And this will break down the components of the molecule into smaller molecules. They'll be taken up again by the axon and recycled into new acetylcholine. When it's broken down, it can no longer bind to the motor end plate, so it doesn't keep causing contraction, okay? And this happens as soon as acetylcholine is released. Some of it will bind to the motor end plate, but the rest of it's broken down. And so this allows us to have really good control over our skeletal muscle contractions so that we can relax as quickly as we want to. So both of these things are happening all the time. Okay, and that is it. So what we'll do on Monday is we will review, okay? We will go through this stuff again. Tuesday, we'll review. That is basically it, okay?
So when somebody has like a contracture or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and it's permanent, is there like or something usually, like, what is going on there? Is it a breakdown of the calcium channels, or?
Like when they have a contraction that
Like
they
when
can't.
people are all like this and they stay like that, is there
Um,
contractures?
I think sometimes people are born that way because of, you know, they have cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy can cause different kinds of what's called spastic paralysis, where the muscle is not relaxed, it's contracted. But it's referred to as paralysis because if you can't relax your muscle, then you can't use it. You can't use the body part normally. So it's considered to be a type of paralysis. That actually has to do with damage to the upper motor neurons that come from the brain and go down into the spinal cord. We also have lower motor neurons that go from the spinal cord to the muscle. When those are damaged, it usually causes what's called flaccid paralysis, where the body part is paralyzed but is not contracted. Yeah. So it can be caused by different types of damage to the neurons, but that's one of the things that can cause it is cerebral palsy when people are born with some kind of a birth injury, usually causes that. So you guys have all the steps leading to muscle contraction, starting with the action potential in the motor neuron. And I just wanted to point out here that nerve impulse is just another way of saying action potential. Okay, it's the same thing. Muscle impulse is, where is it? Yeah, muscle impulse, again, same thing. This is the action potential in the muscle cell. It's the same exact thing. Okay, just so you don't get confused with that. So this will take you through those steps again. And this is what we've already talked about. Okay, and this is a diagram that you have in your book that if you kind of go through it step by step, it walks you through all of that. This will include how ATP is broken down by the myosin heads. You do not have to know that. Okay, you'll talk about it when you take physiology, but you don't have to know about that for now. So if you're going through this and you see that and you think, I don't know that, don't worry about it, okay? It's right here. In this step, they talk about that. Okay, so don't worry about that part of it. And then this tells you, again, what we just talked about as far as how the cell relaxes. Okay? You guys think of any other questions on anything? Any of that? If you come up with anything when you're studying over the weekend, feel free to email me. Okay, so another thing that I want you guys to know, and I think that as you look at your muscles on your study guide, this is something that will become kind of obvious to you, because I think, as you start learning their names, you'll know all of this. But I want you to think about the names of the muscle and what the name tells you, because every part of the muscle's name tells you something about it. And sometimes when you're stuck, like on the test, you're trying to remember the name of a muscle, if you think about this, it will help you, okay? So some of the names tell you muscle action, like for instance, like say the flexor digitorum longus. Actually, there's a longus that's on your list. Okay, so this part of the name tells you the action, right? Tells you it's a flexor. Digitorum tells you what it moves, right? Digits. And longus tells you the length of the muscle. I didn't include a lot of, shorter muscles that are entirely within the hand or the foot on your list, but wherever you have a longus, that means that there is going to also be a brevis. Brevis means brief, right? Like short. So this tells you length, okay? So there's a lot of muscles that are named this way, where part of the name is the muscle action. Like we have flexors, extensors, the pronator teres is on your list, the supinator muscle is on your list. So remember, you guys, don't forget to go over those actions in chapter 9, right? You guys looking at those? Yeah? Okay, some of the names also tell you the body region, like the abdominal muscles or pectoral muscles. Okay, so for instance, pectoralis major. What does this name tell you?
It's the most outer.
Well, it tells you the region, right? Pectoral region is the chest, and it tells you it's big, right? Major means large. We have also a pectoralis minor, and this is the deeper muscle that's smaller, okay? Some of the muscles are named after the attachment, and I don't remember, you had that question, was it in this class? Do you remember Like for instance, sternocleidomastoid. So some of them are actually named after their origin and insertion. In this case, this muscle has two origins, the sternum and the clavicle. So these are the origins, and the second part of the name will be the insertion. Another muscle that's named that way would be the coracobrachialis, right? Or the brachioradialis. So the names sometimes tell you the bones that the muscle's attached to. Okay, orientation of muscle fibers. This would be like, for instance, in the abdominal region, we have the obliques, or the transverse abdominis, or the rectus abdominis. Rectus means straight. Like the rectus abdominis runs straight up and down the abdomen. We have a rectus femoris here, right? So sometimes just thinking about the name will tell you if you're naming the muscle correctly or not, okay? So shape, size, length, we've already talked about size and length. It's really common to see these in the name of the muscle, but also shape. Some muscles are named after their shape, like the deltoid. Deltoid means triangular, or rhomboids. Rhomboids are four-sided, right? They're shaped kind of like this. Okay, or the trapezius. A trapezoid is a four-sided figure. You guys know the trapezius muscle up here is four-sided, right? Shaped kind of like a diamond. And also, you know that the muscles that have more than one head or origin are named after the number of origins, right? Like biceps, triceps, and you guys know you need to know those different parts of the muscle, correct? Okay, like short head, long head, lateral head, medial head, etc. Okay, so you have this table, and this kind of gives you a few examples of muscles that are named based on their whatever attachments, body region, action, etc. And I will ask you about this on the written exam, okay? Okay, guys, so you know the test is next Thursday.
For the gastrocnemius, did you want us to know the lateral head and medial head, or just?
That's okay. No, just for that one, it's okay to just know the whole thing is a gastrocnemius. But for the other ones, I do want you to be able to identify the heads. Okay, so, alrighty, don't forget to look at the muscle tissues. I did not see many people doing that last time. They're actually easy to identify. It would take you 10 minutes to look at them, so don't forget to do that, okay? And all the muscle models are out. If you guys need help, just yell. Okay. Any questions on anything? Okay, you guys. I'm concerned because everyone is so quiet, and it looks to me like everyone is either completely bored or asleep, or I don't know. I can't tell. So the test will be next week. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to go ahead and do this next Thursday. Okay, so I hope you guys can become more interested. I don't know. I'm not seeing a lot of interest. I don't know what's going on. But this is important for you guys to know. The muscular system it's an organ system that you do need to know about. You will need to know this stuff when you get to physiology. So I'm not sure what's happening, but what's going on? What?
Today's Thursday.
Today's Thursday.
I don't know, you guys. I don't know what to say. Okay, well, help yourself.